Well, greetings, everyone, and welcome to God Save the King. I am your host, Tim Kais. Thank you for listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told Radio Network, and you can hear my show every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on TBTRN. So, God Save the King is my ongoing 30-plus year biblical, historical, and scientific research project devoted to retelling the Nativity the way it really would have happened. And this is because the traditional nativity story is, in fact, Christian mythology and bears only the vaguest resemblance to, again, what really would have happened. So sit down, have a listen, open your mind, open your ears, because maybe the nativity doesn't look quite like we think it does. So if you've listened to my show before and you appreciate content like this, would you please make sure that you subscribe to my posts and my videos both on my website and on the Truth Be Told Radio Network website. So that means, like, follow, subscribe, all of the above. You can go to the Truth Be Told Radio Network and you can click on the big listen button and you can sign up there. You can also go to God Save the King, www.godsavetheking.org, and get on my mailing list there as well. So let's just kind of dive into it right away tonight. We got a lot to talk about. I've spent the past several episodes talking about these mysterious wise men from the East. Now, when you look at, like I said, the one of the premises behind God Save the King is that the traditional nativity story just doesn't really cut it. Okay, it really didn't go down like that. And the real nativity would have only had the vaguest resemblances to that. Now, a lot of the bullet points remain the same. Make no mistake there. There's a handful of bullet points that remain the same, right? Joseph and Mary had traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem. No problem there. Yes, the shepherds found a baby wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying in a manger. No problem there. Yes, the young child Jesus and his parents, now note, young child Jesus and his parents were visited by these wise men from the East. And yes, Joseph, Mary, and Jesus fled to Egypt to avoid Herod's wrath, and Herod did indeed murder all the male children in and around Bethlehem. But it's some of the details in between that are not exactly the same. And frankly, some of them may not really matter all that much. Okay, they don't necessarily change our theology, and they certainly don't change our relationship with Jesus, but they really do tell a different story, a very, very different story. And the story becomes, in my opinion, much more exciting, much more epic, and frankly, much more, and I'm going to use an inflammatory term here, much more mythological. But by mythological, pardon me, I do not mean that the story is false. I'm not talking about mythological in the sense of Greek or Roman myth where, we believe these things to be untrue and that it's just the poetic meaning of the story that matters. That's not the case here. When it comes to the Bible, right, we believe that these were literal, true historical events, but the depth of meaning is what I'm talking about when I say it can be mythological, meaning that it's transcendent or it's eternal, right? The truths contained in this story are transcendent and eternal. So that's what I mean when I say, this is mythological, and this story gets much bigger than the traditional nativity story, right? Because as it turns out, there was probably no inn in our sense of the word. There wasn't a motel that Joseph and Mary stayed in. They most likely stayed in a traditional Judean home, but there was no room in the guest room. And then because household animals were kept in the house, the feeding trough for the animals would have been in effect in the living room. And therefore, because there was no room in the guest room, the manger, the stone feeding trough used to feed the animals, would have made a great makeshift bed in the larger common room that would have been occupied by Joseph, Mary, and other family members that would have slept there as well. And that would have been common in a traditional Judean home. So there's no inn, there's no evil innkeeper that threw them out. Joseph and Mary were not, what's the word I want to use, exiles or, aliens, right? In any way, shape, or form. Jesus was born surrounded by loving family, is really what happened here. But if you're talking about the traditional nativity story, another one of the errors that we are unfortunately all too familiar with when you're setting up your nativity scene every year at Christmas time, we place the wise men on one side of this is an ongoing joke in God Save the King, the symmetry of your nativity scene, right? Is your crutch is that you put your wise men on one side, you put your shepherds on the other, so they're nice and symmetrical. But the problem is that the wise men weren't there the night Jesus was born. The Bible is really very clear about this, that the shepherds found a baby in a manger, but the wise men, they found a young child in a house, right? And when the wise men showed up at the court of Herod the Great and they ask Herod about it, because they assume, interestingly enough, they assume Herod knows something about what's going on, at least a little bit, right? Herod, inquires of them diligently. It says Herod diligently inquires of them what time the star appeared, and then based upon that knowledge, that is why Herod kills the male children 2 years old and younger, and we assume that he allows a little bit of margin for error there, so to speak, okay? And he's basing it off of the timing of the star. So there's something about the timing of what the Magi saw that is directly connected to the birth of Christ, see? But also the reason I'm bringing this up is because in the conversation between Herod and the Magi, he refers to the young child several times. The young child, the young child, the young child. They're not calling him a baby anymore. They're calling him a young child because that's what they are expecting to find. So based upon the chronology that we discuss elsewhere, we believe that Jesus was born on September 11th of 3 BC, that the initial astronomical event that the Magi saw that whole thing off was the sighting, okay, the official sighting of the heliacal rising of Jupiter in conjunction with Regulus in Leo on July 29th of 3 BC. And that this kicked off a concentrated series of celestial events involving Jupiter and Regulus in Leo, but it includes conjunctions with other planets. It includes eclipses of the moon and all kinds of stuff. And we'll get into that in detail on, another show to really run you through the different celestial events that most likely happened. But that's what kicked it off, right? So, and then also based upon the fact that that concentrated series of events lasted through October of 2 BC, right? So I believe that the Magi saw this series of events. They're asking themselves the whole time, well, what do we do? What does this mean? Because this was unprecedented series of celestial events that really got their attention. And when they came to the realization that this meant that either the Jewish Messiah had been born, or frankly, that the King of the world had been born, that was what motivated them to leave Parthia and engage in an official ambassadorial visit to the west, to Judea, with military escort, to walk right into the court of Herod the Great and say, where is the legitimate king of the Jews? That this was really, really, really a big deal, a really big deal to the Magi. So there had to be a lot of information. But at any rate, that series of events wraps up in October of 2 BC. They need to decide what to do, and it takes them a little time to get their act together. So they plan for their trip, and we say, okay, so maybe it takes them 30 days to plan for their trip, and then they leave for Judea in, mid-November-ish, of 2 BC, which means they arrive in Judea in mid-December, mid to late December of 2 BC. And then that is further confirmed, okay, by what are known as the stations of Jupiter. And we'll get into more detail about this at another time as well, that once the Magi met with Herod, and Herod tells them, oh yeah, by the way, because Herod consults with the Jewish religious leaders, and the Jewish religious leaders inform both Herod and the Magi that the Messiah is to be born in Bethlehem, that the Magi had essentially due south from Jerusalem to go to Bethlehem. And this is in the record in Matthew 2, that we are told that the star that they had seen in the rising, in its helical rising, so that it means the planet Jupiter went before them and stood over where the young child was. And like I said, we'll discuss this in detail in another episode, but this is referring to what is known as the stations of Jupiter, because Jupiter was a very conspicuous planet to the Mesopotamian Magi. They tracked Jupiter on a daily basis, and that includes a thing called retrograde motion. And it's the retrograde motion that would have caused Jupiter to appear to stand still directly above Bethlehem. So it's not what the traditional story says, that it was like a spotlight that shone down exactly where Jesus was, because that's pretty erroneous and pretty weird, actually. But that's not what happened. But it was that the star Jupiter stood above Bethlehem, and it appeared to stand still because Jupiter engages in some pretty interesting rotational and orbital activity, right? Orbital is actually the right word there. Engages in some very interesting orbital activity, and it would have appeared to have stood still over Bethlehem. So, and we know, because we can punch this into a computer these days, we know that Jupiter, the particular stations of Jupiter at that time occurred in late December of 2 BC. I forget off the top of my head. I think it's the 28th and 29th of December, if I remember right. I'd have to look that up to make sure I have the exact date. But like I said, we can look that up with an astronomy program and determine on what days would Jupiter have stood still over Bethlehem. And that's like December 28th of 2 BC. And this makes complete sense because over the years of research, we have also determined that that Herod died in 1 BC. Herod did not die in 4 BC. Contrary to the opinion of Emil Schur in his, amazing work that he did on the Jewish people in the time of Christ, his calculations were wrong. I'm sorry, they were wrong. Because prior to Schur, all the early church fathers and the major church historians who were tracking this kind of stuff, they absolutely believed that Jesus was born in 2 or 3 BC, which means Herod had to have died in like 1 or 2 BC. And then Schur comes along in the late 19th century and goes, no, Herod died in 4 BC. And that threw everything completely out of whack, because now, because of Schur and because his opinion went unchallenged for about the next 60 years, it got put in Bible dictionaries and Bible encyclopedias and stuff like that, and it went unchallenged for about 60 years. Everybody assumed that Herod died in 4 BC. So because of that cutoff point, right? If Herod died in 4 BC, then Jesus, quote unquote, had to have been born earlier than that. So therefore, people went looking for Jesus's birthday earlier than that, and they went looking for celestial events earlier than that. But once we correct that date and we realize that Herod died in 1 BC, then the chronology that I'm speaking of makes complete sense. The initial heliacal rising in July of 3 BC, Jesus's birth and the woman clothed with the sun in September of 3 BC, an unprecedented series of concentrated events involving Jupiter and Regulus in Leo, beginning in July of 3 BC and running through October of 2 BC. Then the Magi getting their act together, leaving Ctesiphon and other places. I don't think they came from one location only. I think the word had been spread, and that Magi in other cities apart from the Parthian capital would have engaged in this pilgrimage, in this ambassadorial visit to go visit this newborn king of the Jews. So that's part of what I want to talk about tonight, continuing in our discussion of the historical background of who the Magi were. Because what we discussed in other episodes is that we know, really beyond a shadow of a doubt, that celestial observation played a major role in Mesopotamian culture for quite some time. Up until this point, this has really been a big deal. And what the heck here? I'm trying to screen share with you guys, and the graphic that I'm looking for doesn't appear to be there. Where did it go? Sorry, guys. I don't mean to do this to you. Okay, fine. I'll just keep talking. Anyway, so like I said, the fact that Mesopotamian celestial observance had been a big deal for, frankly, thousands of years is pretty well established. And what we've been working on for quite a while has been, okay, we're aware of the fact that they engaged in this celestial observation. But by the time we get to the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew describes these visitors as Magi, as Magoi in Greek. And he really offers no explanation who these guys were. So therefore, following the rules of biblical hermeneutics, we kind of have to assume that Matthew assumed that his audience would know who these men were, that it wasn't some great mystery to them. Okay, Matthew knew who they were, and then when he shared it with his readership, we're assuming that that his audience, Matthew's audience, knew who these men were as well. So we've been following the history of the Magi, and we got to the point where what we started to discuss was the fact that it was right around the time of Daniel, frankly, that that is really okay. I am not happy here. Is that going to do it? Okay, fine. So I upgraded my OS on my computer yesterday, and this is my first time using StreamYard since I upgraded my OS, and it's messing with my ability to screen share here. So you just get to hear me talk. So anyway, let's get on with it. So a quick review here. Around the time of Daniel, right, is when we presume the label Magi began to stick, because Daniel, was captured by Nebuchadnezzar and taken back to Babylon to work in the Babylonian court. And then when Nebuchadnezzar has his dreams and threatens the wise men of Babylon that if they can't interpret his dream, he's going to kill him, right? Daniel falls into that category, and Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they, engage in a prayer campaign, and they get the answer, and they interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And as a result of demonstrated ability to interpret dreams, Daniel is appointed the chief of the Magi. He is declared Rab Mag, Rab meaning head or chief, and then Mag being an abbreviation of Magi. And that's Daniel, right? So the presumption becomes, and it's reasonable, this is not an unreasonable assumption, that Daniel passed on his knowledge to the body of the Magi, right? That he passed on his knowledge to the body of the Magi, and that, maybe even if all of them didn't believe it, that at least maybe a subset, okay, of the Magi knew what Daniel was talking about and kept that knowledge alive, for lack of a better word, right? Kept that knowledge alive, for lack of a better word, for quite a long time, so that by the time we get to the Magi arriving in Judea, okay, to meet with Herod, that, like I said, that the label Magi is understood, and that Matthew's readers recognized who these Magi were and what they would have represented. Okay, now Daniel, okay, not only served in the Babylonian court, he also served briefly in the Persian court, because it's in Daniel chapter 5 where we get the famous incident of the handwriting on the wall, right? And that, Daniel is called upon to interpret, the handwriting on the wall, and he tells Belshazzar, right, that his days are numbered. And we won't go into all the detail now. Once again, we'll do it in another episode. That the Persians and the Medes, the Medo-Persians, are in fact in the process of invading Babylon. They are going under the city walls pretty much as we speak, and they are about to conquer the city of Babylon and the empire of Babylon pretty much without a shot being fired, right? So what happens is now the Persians become the big gorillas on the block, and Daniel serves in their court for at least a little while, okay? Now, but once again, the Magi maintain their role, their primary role at least, under the Persians, right? That this is a class of scholar. This is a class of academic. This is a class of political official. This is a class of religious official. They cover all of these categories, and they have been serving in the Babylonian court. And we know that both before and coterminous with the Babylonians, you had the same in the Assyrian court. You had the same thing. So it is completely in keeping to recognize that you would have the same thing in the Persian court, that the Persian court would have all of these officials, right? These religious / political officials who would serve the king, and they did. Now, we are also aware, okay, and we won't get into detail about this because it actually distracts from where I want to go, that during the Persian Empire at this time was when the Persians adopted Zoroastrianism as their national religion. But the key we need to remember here is that this class of Mesopotamian scholarly astronomical observer far predates Zoroaster. I mean, by a ton, okay? Because it's a common assumption that the Magi were Zoroastrians and that is where they got their belief from. And that just simply is not true, okay? You also have to remember that Mesopotamian culture on the whole, okay? So whether you're talking about the Sumerians or the Akkadians or the Assyrians or the Medes or the Babylonians or the Elamites or the Medes or whatever, that Mesopotamian culture has kind of grown and shifted throughout the centuries. There's always huge overlap and huge similarities, but there's also various shiftings in what they believed and when they believed it and things like that. So this, once again, this classification of highly knowledgeable, highly influential political and religious celestial observer far predates Zoroastrianism. So now So it's reasonable to conclude. Here we go. It is reasonable to conclude that this classification of celestial observer influenced Zoroastrianism as much as Zoroastrianism influenced them. Okay, there was probably cross pollination. That's highly likely. Don't no reason to get weird about that. But this is very likely. Okay, that there was this cross pollination, and once again, that the people we know as the Magi, they predated Zoroaster. So I'm trying to overemphasize the fact right now that the Magi were not Zoroastrians, and that Zoroastrian is not what defines the Magi. The Magi had been around for a long time prior to Zoroaster, and prior to the time that the Persian Empire made Zoroastrianism their official religion. Okay. But now, another piece of the puzzle that's extremely important here is that Persian foreign policy was somewhat different than Babylonian policy. The Assyrians, if we back up that far, when they would conquer a nation, they would take enormous portions of the population captive, and frankly, they would transfer them to another part of their empire, and then take people from another part of the empire and ship them off to, and import them to other parts of the empire, so that they deliberately intermixed the population so that they would reduce the notion of national identity, and therefore reduce the likelihood that the people in these areas would rebel against them, right? So that was the Assyrians. The Babylonians did something very similar, but they tended to focus on the royalty and the nobility is who they would take captive. They would hold them hostage, and then they would have, hostage, quote unquote, right? But then they would take certain portions of the family hostage, but then there'd be a vassal king back in the home country operating at the behest of the Babylonians, right? And we saw that, we talked about that previously, that the prophets were trying to tell the vassal kings of Judea, do not rebel against the hand of Babylon, right? This is God's hand reproving and correcting us, so just let it run its course, right? But when they rebelled against Babylon, that Babylon just came down on them like a hammer, right? So now you've got the Persians conquering the Babylonians, and you've got the Persians inheriting all of the Babylonian captives. And by this time, this is the largest Jewish population to exist outside the Bible lands, right? Or the outside of Judea, outside of Canaan, right? Is in Babylon. And when the Persians take over, okay, Cyrus the Great decreed that the Jews could return home and build their temple. So a little bit different foreign policy. The Persians were going to allow the Judeans significantly more liberty as long as they kept their nose clean. As long as they paid their tribute, and as long as they didn't rebel against Persian hegemony, they would kind of be allowed to kind of go about their business. So Cyrus the Great makes this decree and says, yeah, go ahead, go on home, rebuild your temple, restart your religious observances, not a problem, right? And this lasted for, this lasted for, roughly 200 years, roughly, right around there, about 200 years, until the Greeks came in, okay? And they conquered the Persians, and we'll get into that. We'll probably touch upon that here in a minute. As a matter of fact, we're going to start to make that transition, frankly, right now, right? So the Jews were allowed to observe their own religion and their own laws with little to no outside governmental interference. Persia retained its policy of tolerance until internal politically. They maintained their policy of tolerance until, here you go, internal political rivalry erupted over the office of the high priest. okay, which brought punishment in the form of the partial destruction of Jerusalem again, right? Okay, but other than this, the Jewish people were pretty much left undisturbed by the Persians, okay? So in March of 515 BC, the rebuilding of the temple was, essentially completed, okay? But so this is, 515, right? And then once like I said, you jump forward about 200 years, that's when you're going to get to the conquest of Persia by Alexander the Great. So you got about 200 years here of significant historical events. So I want to try to put this in a little bit of perspective here. And rats, I sure wish I could. I'll get my graphics good to go for next time, because see, the Persians were also expanding to the west, right? They were going through Asia Minor and invading the Greek homeland, and the Greeks did not like this at all. I mean, the Persians and the Greeks hated each other with a passion, and that's going to set the stage for Alexander the Great, okay? So the Persian Empire, like I said, was very expansionist, and they invaded Greece in 492 BCE, okay? So the very famous Battle of Marathon occurred in 490, okay, where the very, very heavily outnumbered Greeks defeated the Persians, thus ending the first Persian invasion of Greece, right? But in 480, the Persians invaded Greece again. And this is the time frame for the very famous Battle of Thermopylae that we hear about, from the movie The 300, etc., where the myth, or the legend at least, is that 300 Spartans heroically delayed the million-man army of Xerxes I, and prevented, delayed them before they came, went any further, right? So that's, 490 was the first invasion, 480 is the second invasion. To help put things in perspective even a little more, so in 469, that's when Socrates was born, okay? Now I'm covering large chunks of time very quickly here. So 469, Socrates is born. 445, the Persian ruler Artaxerxes Longimanus, he makes the decree that the city of Jerusalem can be rebuilt, okay? So up until this point, it was only the temple. Now it's the city can be rebuilt, okay? Then in 428, it's 428, 427, the date is disputed. That's when Plato was born. And then in 384, Aristotle is born, right? And these three men, taught each other, basically. Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle. In 356, Alexander the Great was born, okay? In 343, King Philip II of Macedon hired Aristotle to teach Alexander. So you've got Socrates teaches Plato, Plato teaches Aristotle, Aristotle taught Alexander the Great, okay? And then in 336, Philip II of Macedon was assassinated by his own bodyguards, and that puts Alexander, quote unquote, Alexander the Great, on the throne at the ripe old age of 18. He's 18 years old when he ascends to the throne of Macedon at the time, Macedonia, right? Right. So to kind of summarize up till this point, when the Persians conquered Babylon, they inherited a large population of Jewish captives living within their borders, okay? Now, only a small portion, here you go, this is why this is important, only a small portion of the Hebrew captives took advantage of the offer to return to their homeland, leaving a significant population in Babylonia. And when I say Babylonia, I mean the geographic region, because it's now under the hegemony of the Persian Empire, but it's in the region that we would call Babylon or Babylonia, right? Babylon being the city, but the surrounding area being known as Babylonia, right? So like I said, Persian foreign policy towards the Jews was, considerably different, which was essentially, as long as you don't rebel and as long as you pay your tribute, will allow you to govern yourselves, right? So now as a result, the Jewish populations in both Babylon and in Judea began to prosper. Okay. But they are now going to take on very different characteristics because, in very, very broad strokes, the Jews that returned to Judea were more zealous and they were interested in a much more hair splitting keeping of the law and things like that. Whereas the Jewish population that remained behind in Babylon, okay, they entered into business, they began to intermarry with the Persians, and now you have a very closely intertwined history of the Jews and the Persians, okay? And this is still quote unquote Mesopotamia, because the Persian Empire, as empires often are, okay, is not exclusively ethnically Persian, okay, because they have conquered central and southern Mesopotamia, because technically Persia is actually more to the east, right? It's more what we would, the area that we're discussing, okay, Mesopotamia. When we talk about Babylon and Assyria, we're talking primarily modern Iraq, right? Whereas Persia is primarily modern Iran, which is further to the east, right? But it still borders Mesopotamia. And once again, you still have the commingling of these cultures. But as empires go, and like we said, take note, the Persian Empire extends all the way to Judea. So that's not only Iran and Iraq, but also modern Syria, modern Jordan, right? This is a giant chunk of land. So you've got a wide variety of ethnicities and a wide variety of former city states and nation states that now fall under the umbrella of the Persian Empire. Okay. So it's not just a single, ethnically pure, thing you've got going on here. So my point being is that you've got Jews, right? You've got Jews living in the region of Babylonia, in the city of Babylon, who are becoming part of the culture. They are in business, they are intermarrying, and they are undoubtedly serving in the Persian royal court. I mean, we won't, once again, I'm going to sound like a broken record here. We're not going to go there today. We'll go there some other time, but read the book of Esther, right? You clearly have Jews in prominent positions in the Persian court. And that means they are at the barest of minimums bumping elbows with this classification of scholarly, political, and religious official that engages in significant celestial observation. And let's go ahead and go there, recognizing the distinct possibility that due to Daniel's influence, you may literally have Jews among the Magi, right? Now, we don't have explicit records of this that we're aware of beyond Daniel, but it stands to reason, due to the very closely intertwined histories now, that you've got Jewish Magi, okay, that they're ethnically Jewish, or frankly, enough time has gone by that they could be ethnically mixed, right? And yet still have significant Jewish religious background and are now serving in the Persian court. This is very significant because it contributes to the notion that it's highly probable that this knowledge that began with Daniel continued to be passed down either as open information or as secret information or as, frankly, as a little bit of both, right? Very, very interesting how this moves forward, right? So now we get to the point where, so what I was talking about is that how the Jews operated outside the promised land, right, was very different from how the Jews operated inside the promised land. You've now got a major Jewish population outside of the promised land. You've got Jews that have returned to the promised land. They've rebuilt the temple. They're beginning to rebuild the city, and they are very zealous for the law. Very zealous for the law. Now, I'm not saying that the Jews in Babylon were not zealous for the law, but not the same way the ones were who were back in the promised land. And what's about to happen next, of course, is now the Greeks are going to come through. The Greeks are going to come through and they're going to just bulldoze this entire region. And now they're going to bring their influence into the situation as well. And under the Greeks, I'm getting ahead of myself here, under the Greeks, there's a very significant difference in how the Jews in Babylon survived under the Greeks, and then how the Jews in the Promised Land survived under the Greeks. This is very significant, and once again, it goes to our understanding of who the wise men are, okay? Because now the Greeks, they operated differently than the Babylonians before them or the Persian, the Assyrians, the Persians, pardon me. The Greeks operated very differently than the Assyrians, the Babylonians, or the Persians. They brought in a whole different way of doing things, okay? So even though Judea was under the influence of Persia for a couple hundred years, now here comes the Greeks, right? And this changes everything. I mean, just absolutely changes everything. Alexander the Great, very quick, he invades Persia. I mean, his father had planned on invading Persia because, like I said earlier, the Greeks and the Persians, they hated each other really, really bad. The Persians had been invading and trying to invade Greece for, frankly, a couple hundred years at this point. And the Greeks have just had a belly full of it by now. And Philip, Alexander's father, he spent most of his career reconquering and reuniting the various Greek states of Macedonia, Thrace, Illyria, and Greece proper with the intent of invading and conquering Persia, okay? And the invasion had started a little bit, and with plans for a larger force to follow when Philip was assassinated in 336, okay? So Philip's dream for conquering the Persian Empire now lay in the hands of his successor, his son Alexander III, most commonly known as Alexander the Great, okay? And historians, both ancient and modern, recognize that, frankly, without the military and political efforts of Philip, Alexander never would have been as successful he was. It was Philip's preparation that made it possible, because he created this immensely powerful Macedonian army that would eventually be led by Alexander, okay? So, Philip gets assassinated 336, and then between 334 and 331, you got to think about this, Alexander is like 22, 23, 24, 25 years old. He defeats the Persian king Darius III in 3 decisive battles: Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, 3 huge battles of the ancient world. And as a result, this precipitated the downfall of the Persian Empire, especially Gaugamela. By the time that Alexander defeated Darius at Gaugamela, that's it. Once again, the quote unquote, the handwriting is on the wall, not literally this time, but in a figurative sense that, the Persian Empire is on its way down. Okay. So by the time he had finished, Alexander had reconquered Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey. He had and moving west to east, right? He had reconquered Syria. He had reconquered the Levant, meaning Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. He had reconquered Egypt. Okay. He had reconquered Babylon, which is modern Iraq. He had reconquered Persia, which is modern Iran. And he had even pushed as far as Central Asia, the countries that we now call Afghanistan and Pakistan and portions of Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan and even into Western India. The point being is that Alexander's empire was enormous, absolutely enormous, and he did it really fast. I mean, he did it very, 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 very quickly. And, he is noted as, frankly, one of the greatest military geniuses of all time, right? And he was an inspiration for later conquerors that were aware of his exploits. So whether it's Hannibal or Pompey or Caesar or even Napoleon, they were well aware of what Alexander pulled off and, tried to emulate him. But the irony and maybe even tragedy, right, is that Alexander never got to truly reign over his own empire, right? As fate would have it, Alexander died on either June 10th or 11th, we're not precisely sure, of 323 at his capital of Babylon. At his capital of Babylon, and he died of he just overdid it for way, way too long. A combination of alcoholism, debauchery, and, the combined effects of 12 years of military campaigning, disease, fever, exhaustion, etc. And he was 33 years old. That was it. 33 years old, conquered the known world, and then died at 33 years old. Now, he died without a viable heir. This is critical, right? And therefore, his strongest generals quickly laid claim to various portions of his empire. And this is known as the Wars of the Diadochi, which simply means his successors. Pardon me, his successors. So, following the Battle of Ipsus in 301 BC, the division of the empire had pretty much stabilized into 4 parts. It started with 5 generals, and then one was defeated. And so, like I said, by about 301 BC, the Battle of Ipsus, it had pretty much stabilized into 4 parts. You've got Cassander, who controlled Macedonia. You've got Lysimachus, who controlled Thrace and a portion of Asia Minor. But then you've got the 2 that are relevant, and these are generals. These are Greek generals, Cassander and Lysimachus. And now you have 2 more generals, and these are the ones that are most important to our story, okay? Number 1, you've got Seleucus. Now, Seleucus, he controlled the remainder of Asia Minor, the part not controlled by Lysimachus. He controlled Syria, Babylon, and all of the eastern provinces. So he got the biggest chunk. He got this huge, great, big, enormous chunk. Now, by this time, the Greek general Ptolemy had pretty much already taken control of Egypt. So he just kind of declared himself governor and really was not very contested with regard to that. Okay. He took over Egypt. But take note. So now you've got Seleucus, who, like I said, he's got Asia Minor, Syria, Mesopotamia, Babylon, and then all the eastern provinces. And now you've got Ptolemy, who's got Egypt, which means that Judea is right smack in between, right? Is right smack in between these two. And what's going to happen here, right, is that Ptolemy, like I said, Ptolemy was already the satrap of Egypt before the Wars of the Diadochi began. So he kind of simply declared Egypt to be his, right? So he, frankly, immediately moved into Judea and took Jerusalem, right? Now, Seleucus, so that would have been Ptolemy the First. Ptolemy the First Soter, he was the first ruler of the dynasty that bears his name. And like I said, he was already satrap or governor of Egypt when the wars began. So he just kind of declared Egypt to be his, and he immediately moved in and took Jerusalem, right? Now, Seleucus the First, Nicator, right? He didn't really like that too much. Now, he's the progenitor of the dynasty that bears his name, right? And he also laid claim to Judea. So now what happens is that Ptolemy says, I'm not giving it up. You can come and take it. So during the 3rd century, right? The 3rd century BC and a decent chunk of the early 2nd century BC, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies fought 5 wars over control of this region, right? And it's a region that was known in classical antiquity as Coel Syria, and it includes Judea and Jerusalem, right? And it was only finally in 195 BC that a peace treaty was signed that gave control of Coel Syria to the Seleucids. But think about that. So you're talking all the way back to right around 300 BC, the entire 3rd century BC, from 300 to 200 BC and a little bit more, there is continual war between 2 Greek empires, right? One on either side of Judea, battling over Judea and, of course, Jerusalem, because, you want to control the inhabitants, and you, of course, want the tribute that they're going to pay. So we're going to wrap up here, but why is this important? The reason this is important is because of a concept known as Hellenism, and what Hellenism is going to do to the Jews in both Babylon and in the Bible land itself, in the Holy Land, in the Promised Land of Judea, right? So this is actually the most significant component of the Greek conquest of the known world under Alexander and then under his successors, is this concept known as Hellenism. Hellenism, in short, means make the world Greek. Alexander wanted to see his entire empire speaking the same language, following the same social customs, and practicing the same religion. It didn't matter what your ethnicity was. It didn't matter what your mother tongue was. And it certainly didn't matter what your religion was. Alexander wanted a unified Greek empire, language, custom, religion, and his generals kept that up. They kept that up, right? And like I said, we're going to wrap up here. My final statement for this show is that what we're going to look at, and we'll just be looking at this in our next show, is the fact that the Jews in Babylonia had a much easier time dealing with this, whereas the Jews in Judea, in the Promised Land, they had a hard time dealing with this, dealing with Hellenism. So the Jews in Babylon were much more cosmopolitan. It was much easier for them to accept ideas that maybe weren't exactly in keeping with Torah, right? And then we're also going to talk about next time, what does this do to the Magi? What happens to the Magi under the Greeks? Because you don't have this collective, unified body of Mesopotamian celestial observers advising the royal court anymore. Not like you did under the Babylonians and the Persians. Now, here's the thing. This doesn't mean that there weren't Magi in the Greek royal courts of the major cities all around their empire. There undoubtedly were. There would have been Magi at Babylon. There would have been Magi at Alexandria. There would have been Magi at Pergamum. At all these learning centers and significant cities throughout the empire, there would have been Magi. It's just that they wouldn't have been this collective body quite like they were under the Babylonians and the Persians. So we are going to explore that more next time, the Magi under the Greeks. So I want to thank you for joining me today. My name is Tim Keyes. You've been listening to God Save the King on the Truth Be Told radio network. Please be sure to join me here every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern. We'll see you next time.